Illyria traced the rim of a crystal glass with a soft cloth, her reflection a pale, defiant ghost in the opulent dining room of Dante Moretti. This villa, a monument of marble and shadows, was her gilded cage. Her family's debt was the lock, and Dante, the man they called the Shadow King, was the keeper. He ruled his criminal empire with the same chilling precision he used to arrange the blood-red roses that dominated his gardens, every thorn a warning, every petal a promise of violence. She polished, her movements a quiet rebellion in the suffocating silence of his domain. He was a creature of darkness, all sharp angles in a pinstripe suit, his face a masterpiece of cruel beauty, scarred by a life she could only imagine in whispers and nightmares. Yet she saw the flicker of something else in his obsidian eyes when he watched her. A loneliness so profound it felt like a shared secret. Her own small act of defiance was a single white rose bush she discovered, neglected, at the far edge of the garden. She tended to it secretly, a fragile symbol of purity in a world stained crimson. Dante never mentioned it, but she knew he saw. He saw everything. Tonight, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the low growl of men who dealt in fear. Dante's cousin and underboss, Marco, a man whose smile was as slick as the oil on his hair, cornered her by the liquor cabinet. His breath, sour with whiskey, ghosted her neck. "Such a pretty little thing to be wiping away dust," he murmured, his hand snaking towards her waist. "A flower like you should be plucked, not pruned," before his fingers could touch her. A voice cut through the room, cold and sharp as shattering glass. Marco. Dante didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The word was a weapon, and it found its mark. Every man in the room froze. Dante rose from his leather throne of a chair, a predator uncoiling. He moved with a liquid grace that was terrifying, his gaze never leaving Illyria. "She belongs to the house," he stated, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He looked at Marco, but his next words were for everyone. "Which means she belongs to me." The declaration was a brand, searing itself onto her skin. It was not a confession of affection. It was a raw, brutal claim of ownership, a display of power that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the man who had dared to touch his property. Humiliation warred with a strange, unwelcome flutter of safety. She was a possession, a pawn in his world. And in that moment she had never felt more trapped, or more terrifyingly protected. The villa became a smaller, more intimate prison after that night. Dante dismissed her from her regular duties, installing her as his personal attendant. She was to serve his meals in his private study, organize his papers, and pour his nightly whiskey, her every move under his watchful, possessive gaze. The proximity was a slow-burning torture, a constant battle of wills fought in loaded glances and clipped sentences. "You should wear this," he'd said one evening, dropping a velvet box onto his mahogany desk. Inside, a diamond necklace glittered like a web of captured stars. It was exquisite, and it felt like a collar. "I am a maid, Mr. Moretti," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I have no occasion for such things." His eyes darkened. "You will call me Dante. And you will wear it because I command it." She met his gaze, her chin held high. "Then it will remain in its box." He didn't lash out. Instead, a slow, dangerous smile touched his lips. "Your defiance is a blade, mia cara. Be careful you don't cut yourself on it." But she saw through the threat. Her defiance intrigued him. A novel challenge in a world where everyone bowed to his will. She used her own weapons, not of violence but of insight. One night, as she placed his glass on the desk, she dared to let her fingers brush the scars that crisscrossed his knuckles. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. "They look old," she whispered, not asking a question but stating a fact. "Memories have a way of clinging to the skin." He bit out, his voice rough. "And yours?" she pressed, emboldened by his crack in composure. "What memories make your eyes look so hollow?" He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the marble floor. He rounded the desk, backing her against the shelves of leather-bound books until the scent of old paper and his expensive cologne filled her senses. "You see too much, Illyria," he growled, his face inches from hers. "It's a dangerous gift. Perhaps it's one you need," she retorted, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was a storm and she was standing in the eye of it, refusing to be swept away. His consigliere Luca, a man with kind eyes that had seen too much horror, saw the shift. "She is a liability, Dante," he warned, his voice low and urgent as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights. "Marco sees her. Your enemies will see her." A weakness. Dante swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice cubes clinking like a death knell. "She is not a weakness," he said, more to himself than to Luca. "She is," he trailed off, unable to voice the truth. She was the white rose in his garden of blood. She was the only thing that felt real. But Luca's words were prophetic. Marco's envy had festered into a venomous poison. He saw the way Dante looked at the maid, the possessiveness that went beyond a simple show of power. He saw a chink in the armor of the Shadow King, and he intended to shatter it. The attack was brutally efficient. One moment Alara was carrying a discarded tray from the study. The next, a gloved hand was clamped over her mouth, a sharp, sickly sweet smell filling her lungs. Her world dissolved into a dizzying blackness. She awoke to the chilling seep of damp stone against her skin and the acrid smell of mildew and decay. Thick, rusted chains bound her wrists to a pillar in the center of a cellar, the metal biting coldly into her flesh. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She fought against it, forcing herself to breathe, to think. Her mind raced, cataloging the darkness, the drip of water, the scuttling sound in the corner. They had been careless. In their haste, they had missed the small, slim phone tucked into the inner pocket of her uniform. Her hands trembled violently as she maneuvered, her muscles screaming in protest, twisting her body until she could just barely reach it. The screen's light was a blinding beacon in the oppressive dark. Her fingers, clumsy with fear and cold, fumbled with the screen. Who could she call? The police were useless, bought and paid for. Her family. They would be killed. A single name, a single face swam into her mind. The monster. The keeper of her cage. The only person in the world with the power to tear this city apart to find her. It was a desperate, insane gamble. Her thumb hovered over his contact. Swallowing the bile that rose in her throat, she typed two frantic words, her only hope, her only prayer. "Help, basement trap." Then she hit send. The tiny swoosh of the message disappearing into the ether, feeling like the last breath she might ever take. Dante Moretti was staring at a map of the city's shipping routes when his phone buzzed. It was a private line, one known by only a handful of people. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. An unknown number. He almost ignored it, but some primal instinct made him open the message. 2 words. "Help, basement trap." For a full second he stared, the letters meaningless. Then a cold dread, an emotion he hadn't truly felt since the day his father was gunned down, washed over him. He knew. He didn't know how, but a certainty settled deep in his bones, cold and heavy as a tombstone. Alara. He was on his feet in an instant, the map and its million-dollar routes forgotten. A primal rage, black and absolute, consumed him. This was not business. This was not a calculated move on the grand chessboard of his empire. This was sacrilege. Someone had dared to touch what was his. Luca burst into the study, his face pale. "Dante, what is it?" "I heard you shout." Dante was already strapping a custom sour to his hip, his movements lethally precise. "Get the car. Trace this number." Now Luca's eyes widened at the feral look on his Don's face. "Who is it? What happened? We need a team, we need a plan." "There is no team," Dante snarled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "And the plan is simple. I am going to burn down whoever is at the end of this signal, and I am going to bring her back. Her." Luca's voice was a whisper. "Dante, per el amor di Dio, you cannot go yourself. A Don does not go into the field. It is unthinkable. It is suicide." Dante grabbed the front of Luca's shirt, pulling the older man close until their faces were inches apart. The cold fury in his eyes made the seasoned consigliere flinch. "They took her, Luca. They put my light in the dark, and for that they will answer to me. Not to my men. To me." He released him, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Is that unthinkable enough for you?" Luca stared, seeing not the calculated leader he had served for years, but a man driven by something far more ancient and powerful than loyalty or greed. He saw a king willing to raise his own kingdom for his queen. "Love's worse than a hit," Luca muttered to the empty room as Dante stormed out. "It makes you stupid." It makes you reckless, he sighed, grabbing his own weapon from a hidden drawer. And it makes you follow. The GPS trace led them to a derelict meatpacking warehouse on the industrial waterfront, a known front for the rival Falcone family. Dante didn't wait for backup. He exited the sleek black sedan before it had fully stopped, a phantom of vengeance melting into the shadows. He moved through the decaying building like a wraith, his senses on fire. The stench of rot and rust was thick in the air, but beneath it, he caught another scent. Faint floral. The lavender soap from his own bathroom. The soap she used. He followed it down a flight of rickety stairs, his every step silent. At the bottom, a heavy steel door was guarded by 2 hulking Falcone soldiers. They never saw him coming. The fight was a brutal, silent ballet of violence. A silenced gunshot, a sickening crunch of bone, and then there was only the sound of Dante's harsh breathing in the sudden quiet. He kicked the door open. The scene inside froze him for a fraction of a second. Elara, chained to a pillar, her face bruised and streaked with tears, but her eyes were blazing with a defiant fire that stole his breath. Marco stood over her, a cruel smirk on his face, holding a phone to his ear. You see, Dante? Your little bird is caged. Now we can discuss the terms of your retirement. Dante's laughter was a chilling, mirthless sound that echoed in the damp cellar. Marco's smirk vanished, his eyes widening in terror as he spun around. How? Dante raised his pistol, the red laser dot painting a perfect circle on his cousin's forehead. You put your filthy hands on what is mine, he said, his voice deceptively soft. There are no terms. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. The fight was over before it began. Dante didn't even glance at the body of his cousin as it crumpled to the floor. His world had narrowed to the woman chained to the pillar. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his movements urgent, desperate. He dropped to his knees before her, his hands hovering over the chains, a tremor running through them. Elara, he breathed, his voice raw with an emotion she had never heard from him. He fumbled with the locks, his usual icy control shattered. Finally, the chains fell away with a loud clatter. His touch was impossibly gentle as he cupped her face, his thumb stroking away a tear from her bruised cheek. Say al sicuro tesoro mio, he whispered. You are safe, my treasure. In that moment, surrounded by death and decay, she wasn't his maid, and he wasn't the Shadow King. They were just a man and a woman stripped bare by violence, their souls laid open. Looking into his eyes, she saw not a monster, but a man terrified of losing his only light. Back in the sterile luxury of the villa, the world outside ceased to exist. Dante carried her himself, brushing past a stunned Luca, and laid her gently on the silk sheets of his own bed. He dismissed the doctor after her injuries were deemed superficial, insisting on tending to her himself. With hands that could break a man's neck, he carefully cleaned the cuts on her face, his touch a feather-like caress. The silence was thick with unspoken words, with the ghost of what had happened in that cellar. The walls between them, once so impenetrable, had been blasted to dust. Why? She finally whispered, her voice hoarse. Why did you come for me yourself? It was reckless. He paused, the cloth in his hand stilling. He looked up, his dark eyes boring into hers, stripped of all artifice. Because a world without you in it is not a world I care to rule, he confessed, the words raw and torn from the deepest part of him. Her breath hitched. The admission hung between them, more intimate than any touch, more binding than any chain. I was so scared, she admitted, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. He caught it with his thumb. Never again, he vowed, his voice a fierce oath. No one will ever touch you again. I swear it on my soul. It was in that moment of raw vulnerability that Luca entered, his face grim. He didn't speak, simply placed a tablet on the bedside table. On the screen was damning evidence. Bank transfers, encrypted messages, security footage. All of it painting a clear picture of Marco's treachery, his alliance with the Falcones, his plot to seize the Moretti Empire. The betrayal was absolute, a serpent they had nurtured in their own house. The family meeting was held in the grand dining room, the long table surrounded by the stern, weathered faces of Dante's capos. The air crackled with tension. Dante stood at the head of the table, not in his usual place of power, but pacing before the hearth, a caged lion. And to the shock of every man present, Elara stood near him, not behind him like a servant, but beside him, a silent, resolute partner. The whispers were immediate. A maid? At a meeting of this importance? One of the older capos, Bellini, cleared his throat. Dante, we have heard rumors that your judgment has been compromised. By this girl, Dante stopped pacing, his gaze sweeping over the men who had sworn fealty to him. My judgment has never been clearer, he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. He laid out Marco's treason with cold, irrefutable facts, the evidence displayed on a large screen. Gasps and curses filled the room. He used this woman, Dante continued, his voice dropping, this brave, innocent woman as a pawn. He saw her not as a person but as a weakness in me. And he was right. A stunned silence fell. She is my weakness, Dante declared, turning to look at Elara, his eyes softening with a fierce, protective love that no one in that room had ever seen from him. She is my heart. And a man with no heart has nothing to fight for. Marco believed that would make me vulnerable. Instead, it has made me invincible. Because now, I am not just fighting for territory or for money. I am fighting for my life. She is my life. He turned back to his men, his eyes blazing. He broke our code. He conspired with our enemies. He threatened what is most sacred. For this, there is only one judgment. The verdict was unanimous. The Moretti family was secure, but it was not the same. It was stronger, anchored now not just by fear and power, but by a fierce, undeniable love. The days that followed were a quiet healing. The villa, once a prison, began to feel like a sanctuary. The blood-red roses in the garden no longer seemed so menacing. One sunny afternoon, Dante found Elara by her small, thriving bush of white roses. She was tending to a new bud, her fingers gentle on the delicate petals. He came to stand beside her, their shoulders brushing. The easy silence between them was a language all its own. He was no longer just her boss, the fearsome Shadow King. And she was no longer his captive maid. They were two halves of a whole, forged in darkness and redeemed by light. A white rose, he murmured, his fingers intertwining with hers. So fragile. So out of place, she smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. Or maybe, she said softly, it's a reminder that even in the darkest soil, something beautiful can grow. They say a king can't rule with a compromised heart. But what if that's the only way he can truly rule at all? Can a mafia boss's heart survive true love? Or does it become his ultimate undoing? Tell me in the comments, what would you risk for a love forged in fire and shadow? And don't forget to share this story if you believe even the darkest kings deserve their light.